Let's starts now. Act 1. The Ashes of Shinjuku. Scene 1. The Hollow Victory. The battlefield of Shinjuku was no longer a city. It was a graveyard of concrete, steel, and broken dreams. The dust of Ryomen Sukuna's crumbling soul hung in the air like a poisonous fog, settling over the jagged remains of skyscrapers. There was no victory cheer. There was no heroic music. There was only a hollow, ringing silence that felt heavier than any cursed technique. The sky, which had been torn apart by malevolent shrine and infinite void, was now a bruised purple, as if the heavens themselves were bleeding. Yuji Itadori stood in the center of a massive crater, his school uniform shredded and soaked in a mixture of his own blood and the black soot of the King of Curses. His chest heaved, each breath a searing reminder that he was still alive while so many others were not. He looked down at his hands. Hands that had punched through the fabric of reality, hands that had held the flickering lives of his friends. They were no longer the claws of a monster. They were just the trembling, scarred hands of a 19-year-old boy. A soft wind blew, carrying the faint, metallic scent of blood. Yuji closed his eyes, and for a split second he saw them. He saw Nanami standing in the subway, half burnt but peaceful. He saw Choso, his brother, turning into ash to shield him from the flames. "It's over," Yuji whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "But why? Why does it feel like I'm the only one left standing in the dark?" He wasn't just a sorcerer anymore. He was a survivor, and that was the heaviest burden of all. Scene 2. The recovery of the strongest. A few hundred meters away, the remnants of the Jujutsu high sorcerers moved like ghosts through the rubble. Meiki Zenin, her body a map of burn scars and battle-hardened resolve, walked toward the spot where the final hollow purple had detonated. Beside her, Shoko Ayeri, the doctor who had spent her entire life stitching together the broken pieces of humanity, stared at the ground with hollow eyes. They found it. The body of Gojo Satoru. He didn't look like the god of the Jujutsu world anymore. He looked small. He looked human. His iconic blindfold was gone, and his 6 eyes, which had seen the infinite secrets of the universe, were finally closed, shielded by long, white lashes. Shoko knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his cold skin. She didn't cry. She had run out of tears years ago when Suguru had turned his back on her. "You always were a handful, Satoru," Shoko whispered, her voice devoid of its usual clinical coldness. "You left me behind again. First Suguru, now you. Did you really think I could handle the world without the two of you?" She looked at the sky, realizing that the era of the strongest had officially ended, leaving behind a world that was suddenly very cold and very fragile. Scene 3. The guilt of the survivors. Inside a temporary medical barrier, the survivors gathered. Megumi Fushiguro sat on a low bench, his head buried in his hands. The weight of what he had done while Sukuna inhabited his body. The blood of his sister Tsuneki, the death of his sensei, was a physical weight crushing his lungs. He felt like a murderer who had been granted a pardon he never asked for. Yuta Akatsu, now back in his own body but pale and exhausted, sat across from him. The stitches on his forehead were a grim reminder of the desperate gamble he took by inhabiting Gojo's corpse. "We did what we had to, Megumi," Yuta said softly. His voice held no judgment, only a deep, weary empathy. We played the roles of monsters so that Yuji could remain human. Don't let that sacrifice go to waste." Megumi looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "He died because of me, Yuta. They all did. How am I supposed to walk through a world that was bought with their lives?" The room fell silent. It was the question every sorcerer asked themselves in the aftermath of a war. Not how to win, but how to live with the cost of winning. Scene 4. The Return of the Third. The sound of light, rhythmic footsteps broke the tension. Everyone turned toward the entrance. A girl stood there, her orange hair messy and a large bandage covering the left side of her face where a patch of skin had been grafted. Nobara Kugisaki leaned against the doorframe, a cocky, defiant smirk playing on her lips, though her eyes were shining with unshed tears. "You guys look like you've seen a ghost," Nobara chirped, her voice a jagged melody in the somber room. "I take a nap for a few months, and you let the whole world go to hell? Honestly, you can't do anything without me." Yuji stood up, his legs nearly giving out. "Nobara?" he whispered, afraid that if he spoke too loud, the vision would shatter. Nobara walked over and punched him lightly on the shoulder, the same shoulder where he had carried the weight of the world. "Yeah, it's me, dummy. Stop crying. It's unsightly." As she hugged both Yuji and Megumi, the original trio was finally whole again, but the space between them was filled with the ghosts of those who weren't there to join the embrace. Scene 5. The last letters of Satoru Gojo. Later that evening, as the first stars began to pierce through the smog of Shinjuku, Ijichi approached the students. In his hands, he held several sealed envelopes, their paper crisp and white against his black suit. Gojo. "He left these for you," Ijichi said, his voice trembling. "He told me to give them to you only if the war ended and he did not return." Yuji took his letter. Megumi took his. Even Meiki and Yuta received one. As they opened the envelopes, they didn't find grand instructions or secret techniques. They found Gojo Satoru's true legacy. His words. Megumi's letter was short. It told him the truth about his father, Toji Zinen. It told him that he wasn't a curse, but a choice. Gojo had chosen him not because of his shadow technique, but because he saw a boy who deserved a future. Megumi gripped the paper so hard it began to tear. He realized that Gojo hadn't just been a teacher. He had been a shield that protected them from the harsh reality of their world until they were strong enough to face it themselves. Scene 6. The Garden of Tomorrow. The final scene of the act shifts to a small, hidden garden within the Jujutsu high grounds. Yuji sat alone under a tree, the same place where he used to train with Nanami. He held a small, charred button in his hand, the only thing he had left of Choso. He looked up at the moon, which was finally clear of the clouds. He thought about Sukuna's final moments. The way the King of Curses didn't curse him, but simply vanished into the void. Yuji realized that the cycle of hatred hadn't just been broken, it had been buried. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" Yuji asked the wind. There was no answer, but for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel suffocating. It felt like a beginning. He stood up, tucked the letter into his pocket, and walked back toward the lights of the school, leaving the shadows of Shinjuku behind. As the screen fades to black, we see a lingering shot of Gojo's desk in the empty classroom. A single flower has been placed there. But miles away, in the deep shadows of the Zenin Estate ruins, a small, dark energy begins to flicker. The world is at peace, but in the world of Jujutsu, peace is always a borrowed time. Act 2. The Legacy of the Cursed. Scene 1. The Weight of the Crown. The sun rose over the jagged skyline of Tokyo, but its light felt sterile, casting long, distorted shadows over the ruins of Shinjuku. The era of the strongest was over, but the vacuum it left behind was a swirling abyss of political chaos and existential dread. Within the temporary headquarters of Jujutsu High, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of old parchment and the sharp, clinical smell of antiseptic. Gakuganji, the once stern principal, sat in a high-backed chair, his fingers tracing the strings of his guitar. Not in music, but in a restless, silent vibration. He was now the head of the Jujutsu world, a position he never truly wanted. Across from him stood Meiki Zenin, her presence like a sharpened blade. Her scars were a testament to the fact that the Zenin clan was dead, but the curse of their history still lingered in the air like stagnant smoke. The higher-ups are gone. Meiki, Gakuganji's voice was a gravelly whisper. The corruption we fought for decades was erased in a single night of Sukuna's madness. But now, we are the ones who must decide what happens to the survivors. We are the ones who must tell the world that monsters are real and that their god is dead. Meiki didn't flinch. She looked out the window at the construction cranes beginning to move in the distance. To her, the world didn't need a god. It needed people who were willing to bleed to keep it spinning. The legacy of the cursed was no longer about killing. It was about rebuilding a world that had forgotten how to feel safe. Scene 2, the reclamation of the soul. In a private medical room, shielded by multiple layers of powerful barriers, Yuta Akatsu lay staring at the ceiling. The stitches across his forehead had begun to fade into thin, silver lines, but the phantom sensation of being inside Gojo Satoru's skull still haunted him. For those few hours, he had possessed the eyes of a god, and the perspective had nearly shattered his humanity. He felt like a thief who had broken into a sacred temple and walked away with a treasure that was too heavy to carry. The door creaked open, and Rika, no longer the vengeful spirit, but a lingering fragment of his own cursed energy, hovered silently by his side. She didn't speak, but her presence was a cold comfort. Yuta sat up, his body aching with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. He had returned to his own body, but he felt like an intruder. "I'm still here," he whispered, his voice hollow. "But am I still Yuta? Or am I just the monster that Gojo-sensei didn't want to become?" He remembered the moment his soul transitioned back. The cold, clinical darkness of the soul realm where he caught a glimpse of Satoru. Gojo hadn't looked back. He had simply walked into the white light, leaving the burden of the next strongest on Yuta's narrow shoulders. It was a gift that felt like a curse. Yuta gripped the bedsheets, realizing that his life was no longer his own. It was a debt he would be paying for the rest of his days. Scene 3. The first steps of the new trio. Outside, in the training courtyard that had seen so many footprints of fallen sorcerers, the air was suddenly split by the sharp crack of a hammer hitting a nail. Nobara Kugisaki was practicing her resonance on a row of straw dolls, her movements fluid but slightly hindered by her lack of depth perception from her missing eye. She didn't complain. She moved with a ferocity that suggested she was trying to kill her own weakness. Yuji and Megumi watched her from the steps. For the first time in over a year, they were together, but the silence between them was different. It wasn't the silence of strangers, but the silence of soldiers who had seen the same hell. "She's getting faster," Megumi noted, his voice devoid of its former brooding edge. He looked at his own shadow, which seemed less like a cage and more like a tool. "We all have to," Yuji replied. He was wearing his new uniform, the one without the hood, symbolizing his growth from a vessel to a sorcerer. The culling game sorcerers are still out there. Megumi. Some are scared, some are angry. If we don't reach them first, the government or the curses will. Yuji's eyes were steady. He had lost his brother, his mentor, and his innocence. But he had found a resolve that was harder than Sukuna's heart. He wasn't fighting to save people anymore. He was fighting to give them a choice. The same choice he was never given. Scene 4. The Mission in the Shadows. The trio's first mission took them to the outskirts of a rural town that had been untouched by the Shinjuku disaster. The contrast was jarring. Green trees, quiet streets, and people living lives that felt like a dream. But beneath the surface, the cursed cycle was already beginning. Fear of the Shinjuku events had birthed a new kind of spirit, a cursed spirit of paranoia. The spirit manifested as a shifting mass of eyes and mouths, whispering the secrets and fears of the townspeople. It wasn't powerful, but it was fast. It's pathetic. Nobara's back, throwing a nail that hung with blue energy. It feeds on the dregs of Sukuna's leftovers. As the trio moved in perfect synchronization, it was clear that they were no longer the students who had struggled against the finger bit. They were a unified force. Megumi's shadow swirled, pinning the spirit's limbs while Nobara's nails shattered its core. But it was Yuji who delivered the final blow. A simple, precise punch that didn't just break the spirit's form, but dispersed its energy completely. There was no divergent fist, no black flash. Just the raw, controlled power of a man who understood the nature of the soul. As the spirit dissolved into purple ash, Yuji looked at the townspeople watching from a distance. They looked at him with a mixture of awe and terror. He realized then that being a sorcerer meant being a ghost that protected the living. Scene 5. The remnants of it. Back at the school, in the quiet hours of the night, Yuji sat in the shrine area where Sukuna's fingers had once been kept. He felt a faint, lingering itch in his soul. Not the presence of the King of Curses, but the hollow space where it used to be. It was like a scar that finally stopped bleeding, but always itch when it rained. He took out the letter Gojo had left him. The ink was elegant, almost playful. Yuji. The letter read, I always knew you'd be the one left standing. Don't spend your life looking back at the shadows. I didn't save you so you could be a gravekeeper. I saved you so you could be a light. Yuji felt a lump in his throat. He thought about the final conversation he had with Sukuna in the soul realm. The way the king had simply accepted his end without a curse or a scream. Even the greatest evil had found its peace. Why couldn't he? He leaned his head back against the cold stone, watching the moon. He thought about Chozo's warmth and the way it felt to be part of a family. I'll be the light, sensei, he whispered. But first, I have to make sure the shadows don't swallow anyone else. For the first time, Yuji's smile didn't feel forced. It was the smile of a man who had finally made peace with his own demons. Scene 6. The Rising Storm. In the final moments of the act, the camera moves away from the school and toward the deep, untamed forests of northern Japan. There, a group of sorcerers who had survived the culling game gathered around a campfire. They weren't heroes. They were mercenaries and outcasts who felt abandoned by the new Jujutsu Kaisen. The era of Gojo Satoru is dead. A voice whispered from the darkness. A voice that sounded like grinding stones. And the King of Curses has left his throne empty. The world thinks it is at peace, but they have forgotten that nature abhors a vacuum. A figure stepped into the firelight. He wore the robes of a monk, but his eyes held a cold, calculating small mummified object. Act 3. The Cursed Evolution. Scene 1. The Ripples of the Void. The world had begun to move on, but the scars left by the Shinjuku incident were not merely physical. They were etched into the collective psyche of humanity. In the neon-drenched alleys of Tokyo, a new kind of fear was festering. It wasn't the loud, explosive terror of Sukuna's reign. It was a quiet, suffocating paranoia. People looked at their neighbors with suspicion, wondering who among them carried the curse of sorcery. Deep within an abandoned underground shrine, a group of curse users, survivors of the culling game, gathered in the flickering candlelight. They were led by a man whose face was half hidden by a traditional fox mask. He didn't possess the overwhelming cursed energy of a special grade, but he possessed something more dangerous, a twisted philosophy. He held a small, crystallized fragment of Sukuna's remains, a tiny shard of bone that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic heartbeat. They think the king is dead, the masked man whispered, his voice echoing like dry leaves skittering across stone. They think the strongest has left them a world of peace. But Sukuna was not just a man, he was a natural disaster. And you cannot kill the wind. You can only wait for it to return. He crushed the bone shard in his hand, and the room was suddenly flooded with a sickly crimson light. The shadows on the walls began to peel away, taking on the jagged, four-armed silhouette of the King of Curses. This wasn't a resurrection. It was an evolution of spite. Scene 2. The Echoes in the Classroom. Back at Jujutsu High, the morning sun filtered through the windows of the second-year classroom. It was the same room where Yuji, Megumi, and Nobara had first met as teenagers, full of hope and hidden fears. Now, the room felt cavernous, haunted by the empty desks of those who would never return. Yuji sat at his desk, his chin resting on his hand as he stared at the chalkboard. He wasn't thinking about techniques or grades. He was thinking about the concept of a proper death. Megumi walked in, carrying a stack of mission reports. He looked at Yuji and saw the distant flicker in his eyes. "You're thinking about him again, aren't you?" Megumi asked, his voice softer than it used to be. "I'm thinking about everyone, Megumi," Yuji replied, turning to look at his friend. Gojo-sensei, Nanami-san, even Higuruma. They all left us something, a piece of their soul. But sometimes, it feels like we're just carrying around a graveyard. Nobara kicked the door open, her boots clattering loudly on the hardwood floor. "Then stop carrying it and start building on it," she snapped, though her eyes softened as she sat on top of Yuji's desk. "We aren't the caretakers of a cemetery. We're the foundation of what comes next. If we stay in the past, the curses win." Scene 3. The Paradox of the New Generation. The trio was summoned to the main hall by Principal Gakuganji and Yutaheim. The atmosphere was tense. Reports had surfaced of ghost sightings across Japan. Residual spirits that looked like Sukuna but acted with a mindless, predatory instinct. "It's an ideological infection," Yutaheim explained, pointing to a map of Japan dotted with red markers. Sukuna's death left a massive amount of cursed energy in the atmosphere. The fear of his return is manifesting these echoes. They aren't the real Sukuna, but they are strong enough to wipe out entire villages if left unchecked. Gakuganji looked at Yuji. "Itadori, as the former vessel, you are the only one who can truly neutralize these remnants. Your soul remembers the structure of his energy. You are the vaccine for this plague." Yuji stood up, his expression hardening. He realized that his journey with Sukuna wasn't over. He was the one who had brought the monster into the world, and he would be the one to erase every lingering trace of him. "Let's go," Yuji said, looking at Megumi and Nobara. "We finished this for good." Scene 4. The Battle of the Mirror Void. The mission led them to the site of the former Zenin estate, a place already thick with the scent of death and betrayal. As they entered the ruins, the world began to warp. The ground turned into a reflective surface of black water, and the sky became a ceiling of rib-like clouds. From the darkness, an echo of Sukuna emerged. It was a terrifying, mindless beast, a manifestation of pure destruction without the king's intelligence. It roared, a sound that tore through the fabric of the barrier. "Don't let it get close," Megumi shouted, summoning Divine Dog, Totality and Max Elephant simultaneously. The shadows surged forward, locking the beast in place. Nobara jumped into the air, her nails glowing with a violent, shimmering blue. "Hairpin!" she screamed, detonating the energy within the beast's chest. The echo shrieked, its body beginning to disintegrate, but it reformed instantly, its claws slashing through Megumi's defense. Yuji charged forward, his body flickering with the red sparks of his soul-striking energy. He didn't use Black Flash. He used a refined, rhythmic strike that targeted the blueprint of the curse. Every punch felt like a hammer hitting a bell, vibrating the very essence of the beast. "You aren't him!" Yuji roared, his fist glowing with an intense golden light. "You're just a shadow, and shadows vanish when the light comes." Scene 5, the final lesson of Satoru Gojo. In the heat of the battle, Yuji felt his energy wavering. The weight of the Echo's malice was trying to pull him back into the darkness. In that microsecond of weakness, a memory flashed, vivid and warm. He was back in the secret basement where Gojo had hidden him during his death. Gojo was sitting on a pile of cushions, eating a bag of sweets. "Listen, Yuji," Gojo said, his blindfold pushed up to reveal one shimmering blue eye. "Being the strongest isn't about how much you can destroy. It's about how much you can protect without losing yourself. One day, I won't be there to draw the line for you. You'll have to draw it yourself. And when you do, make sure it's a line that everyone can cross." Yuji's eyes snapped open in the present. He saw the Echo lunging for Nobara. Time seemed to slow down. He didn't just feel his own energy, he felt the energy of everyone around him. He realized that Gojo hadn't just left them power, he had left them a connection. Scene 6. The Triumphant Soul, Megumi! "Nobara, now!" Yuji shouted. The three of them moved in a synchronized dance of destruction and creation. Megumi expanded his shadow into a vast net, trapping the Echo. Nobara drove a massive nail into the ground, anchoring the beast's soul. Yuji stepped forward, his right hand raised. He didn't use a domain expansion. He used something new, a technique born from his understanding of the soul and Gojo's final lesson, soul resonance, horizon. Yuji whispered. A wave of pure, white energy erupted from his palm, washing over the ruins. It didn't burn, it purified. The Echo didn't scream as it dissolved. It simply faded away, like a bad dream being forgotten upon waking. The barrier shattered, and they were back in the ruins of the Zenin estate. The air felt lighter. The Sukuna scent was gone. Yuji stood panting, his hands still glowing faintly. He looked at his friends, and for the first time, the weight in his chest felt manageable. They hadn't just defeated a curse, they had reclaimed their future. Act 3, closing suspense. As the trio walked away from the ruins, the camera panned up to the sky. High above the clouds, a single white feather drifted down, catching the light of the setting sun. But back at the school, in the deep archives, Shoko Ieri was looking at a medical report that shouldn't exist. The heartbeat of the world was steady, but the rhythm was changing. The final act was approaching, and with it, the truth about the final legacy. Act 4. The Dawn of a New Soul, the finale. Scene 1. The Truth in the Blood. The sterile white lights of Shoko Ieri's laboratory flickered, casting long, tired shadows against the walls lined with jars of preserved, cursed remnants. Shoko sat at her desk, the glowing screen of her monitor reflecting in her hollow eyes. In her hand, she held a medical report that defied the laws of Jujutsu. It was a data analysis of the echoes Yuji had fought in the previous act. "It's not Sukuna," Shoko whispered to the empty room. "And it's not just cursed energy." The report showed that the energy wasn't coming from the king of curses. It was coming from the collective grief of the survivors. The world was literally bleeding its sorrow into the atmosphere, creating monsters out of its own pain. Yuji, Megumi, and Nobara walked into the room, their faces weary but resolute. Shoko turned her chair, her expression softening. "The war didn't end with Sukuna's death, kids. It ends when we stop letting the past dictate our future. These echoes are a mirror. If we keep looking back at the graves, the mirror will never break." Yuji looked at his hands, realizing that the final battle wasn't against the sorcerer, but against the very nature of their world. Scene 2. The Choice of the Forgotten. The trio's final mission led them to a quiet, suburban park where a young boy sat alone on a swing. The boy, barely 12 years old, was surrounded by a swirling vortex of black, ink-like shadows. He was a new vessel chosen not by a demon, but by his own overwhelming fear of losing his family in the aftermath of Shinjuku. The boy looked up, his eyes wide with a terrifying power he couldn't control. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he sobbed. "I just don't want to be alone." Megumi stepped forward, his shadows receding into his own feet. "You won't be," Megumi said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He remembered the cold darkness of Sukuna's void and the way Yuji had reached in to pull him out. Yuji knelt in front of the boy, ignoring the lashing shadows that cut into his skin. "I was a vessel too," Yuji said, placing a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "I carried a monster, and I thought I was alone. But I found people who were willing to carry the weight with me. You have a choice. You can be a curse, or you can be a person. Choose to be a person." The shadows began to dissolve into soft, golden light. The boy fell into Yuji's arms, the cycle of the vessel finally ending not with a seal, but with a hug. Scene 3. The Memorial of the Strongest. The scene shifts to a serene hillside overlooking the rebuilt Jujutsu High. A simple, black stone monument had been erected under a massive cherry blossom tree. There were no names carved into the stone, only a single phrase, "To the ones who held the sky so we could walk the earth." The entire school had gathered. Yutaheim, Gakubanji, Miwa, Inamaki, Panda, and the first years. They stood in a silence that was finally peaceful, not suffocating. Shoko stepped forward and placed a small, blue blindfold on the base of the stone. You were an idiot, Satoru, Shoko said, her voice finally breaking. You were arrogant, annoying, and you never followed the rules. But you were the best of us, one by one. The students placed flowers. Nanami's favorite bread, a small carving of a rabbit for Megumi's shadows, and a simple button from Choso's jacket. As the wind blew, the cherry blossom petals danced around the monument like spirits, and for a fleeting moment, the air felt warm, as if a blue-eyed man was leaning against the tree, laughing at them all. Scene 4. Letters to the Future. In the quiet of the evening, Yuji sat on the roof of the dorms, the 3 letters from Gojo Sensei spread out before him. Megumi and Nobara joined him, sitting on either side. What did yours say? Nobara asked, looking at the city lights. He told me to take care of you too, Megumi replied, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. And he told me that my shadows are meant to protect the light, not hide in it. Nobara looked at her letter. He told me that my eye makes me look badass and that I should never stop being the loudest person in the room. Typical Gojo. Yuji looked at his final letter. It was just one sentence. Live a life you can be proud of, Yuji. I'm proud of you. Yuji folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his heart pocket. He realized that the greatest technique Gojo had ever taught them wasn't the hollow purple or the infinity. It was the ability to love a world that was constantly trying to break them. Scene 5. Years later. The new teacher. The screen fades to black and opens on a bright, modern classroom several years later. A new generation of students sat in the desks, their eyes bright with curiosity. At the front of the room stood a man with a scarred but kind face. It was Yuji Itadori. He wasn't wearing a uniform anymore. He wore a simple black suit, much like Nanami used to. Jujutsu isn't just about killing curses, Yuji said, his voice deep and steady. It's about understanding the soul. It's about being there for someone when their world turns dark. A young student raised her hand. Sensei, were the legends true? About the king of curses and the 6 eyes. Yuji looked out the window at the cherry blossom tree on the hill. They were real, Yuji replied. But the real heroes weren't the ones with the most power. They were the ones who refused to give up on their friends. As the class ended and the students rushed out, Yuji picked up a chalk and drew a small, smiling face on the corner of the board, the same one Gojo used to draw. Scene 6. The Last Smile. Yuji walked out of the school and headed toward the main gate. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. As he reached the gate, he stopped. He felt a sudden familiar warmth on his shoulder. He turned around. For a split second, the world shifted. Standing there, bathed in the evening light, were the shadows of his past. He saw Nanami leaning against a pillar, checking his watch with a small nod. He saw Choso waving from the distance, a proud smile on his face. And right in front of him, leaning against the gate, was Gojo Satori. Gojo didn't have his blindfold on. His eyes were a brilliant, sparkling blue. He didn't say anything. He just gave Yuji a thumbs up and a wink, his spirit fading into the golden light. Yuji's eyes filled with tears, but he was smiling. He took a deep breath of the fresh, clean air and walked through the gate into the world he had helped save. The camera pans up to the sky, higher and higher, until the school is just a small dot on the horizon. The end of the curse, the beginning of a soul. Thanks for everything, everyone. And with that, our journey through the final legacy of Jujutsu Kaisen comes to an end. This world taught us that even in the darkest of curses, there is a light of hope that never fades. Thank you so much for watching and being a part of this epic journey. Your support is what keeps this channel alive and allows us to bring these incredible stories to life. If you love this movie, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to join us for more such incredible anime tales. Keep supporting because we are just getting started. Until next time, remember, live a life you can be proud of. See you in the next story.